In 1937, workers digging beneath the streets of Baltimore made a chilling discovery. Hidden underground, they found a tunnel. Not a sewer line, not a utility channel. A passageway that had once moved human beings from ships to a brick prison just steps from the inner harbor. The man who built that tunnel ran advertisements in the local newspaper almost every single day. His message was simple: cash for Negroes. His name was Hope Hull Slatter, and for over a decade, he was Baltimore's king of the domestic slave trade. By the time he died, he had shipped thousands of men, women, and children from Maryland's shores to the auction blocks of New Orleans, making himself one of the wealthiest men in the region. This is the story of a man who turned human trafficking into a corporate enterprise, and how his legacy haunts the very streets where Americans walk today. Hope Hull Slatter was born on June 11, 1790, in Clinton, Georgia, a small settlement in the dead center of the state. His parents were Methodists who named him after Hope Hull, a prominent minister in the region. That name would become bitterly ironic. By the time young Hope reached adulthood, he would build his fortune not through faith or farming, but through the systematic buying and selling of human beings. To understand how a man like Slatter could rise to such prominence in human trafficking, we need to understand the economic transformation reshaping American slavery in the early 19th century. In 1793, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, a device that could separate cotton fibers from their seeds with unprecedented speed. Suddenly, cotton cultivation became enormously profitable. Plantation owners rushed to plant cotton across the Deep South, from Alabama to Mississippi to Louisiana. But cotton required labor, enormous amounts of it, for planting, harvesting, and processing. The demand for enslaved workers exploded. At the same time, the international slave trade was coming to an end. Congress banned the importation of enslaved Africans effective January 1, 1808. No more ships could legally bring captives from Africa to American shores. The supply of enslaved labor was now limited to natural increase and internal redistribution. This created a massive market opportunity. People who were surplus property in one region could be sold at enormous profit to buyers in another. The domestic slave trade, what historians now call the Second Middle Passage, was born. The records suggest Slatter may have entered the slave trade as early as 1817, when he was just 27 years old. A document from 1828 provides one of the earliest glimpses into his career. The sheriff of Crawford County, Georgia, reported picking up a teenage girl named Amelia who said she had formerly belonged to Hull Slatter of Jones County, who had sold her to a slave trader. The girl was described as about 15 or 16 years of age, of small size, low, and chunky. She could not even remember the name of the trader who had purchased her. Already, Slatter was learning the mechanics of the trade, acquiring human beings and moving them through the market like livestock. By 1833, Slatter was operating on a larger scale. That year, he and his younger brother Shadrach, along with 2 other traders, offered 200 people for sale in Hamburg, South Carolina. This was not a casual transaction. This was a coordinated business operation, the brothers working together to move human merchandise across state lines. The pattern that would define Slatter's career was already taking shape. Hope would handle acquisitions in the Upper South, while Shadrach would manage sales in the Lower South. It was a family business built on human misery. Slatter arrived in Baltimore around 1830, initially setting up a home and office on West Ball Street. He was entering a city perfectly positioned for the domestic slave trade. The international slave trade had been banned by Congress in 1808, cutting off the flow of captive Africans from overseas. But demand for enslaved labor was exploding in the Deep South, where cotton plantations were spreading westward, and sugar operations in Louisiana required backbreaking work under brutal conditions. Maryland, by contrast, had shifted away from labor-intensive tobacco cultivation toward grain production, creating what slaveholders euphemistically called a surplus of enslaved workers. The price differential was stark. A person could be purchased in Maryland for roughly half what they would fetch in New Orleans. For traders willing to exploit this gap, fortunes awaited. Baltimore was the hub. The city's port connected to the Chesapeake Bay and the Atlantic coast, providing direct shipping routes to New Orleans. Its position between north and south made it a nexus for commerce of all kinds. By 1830, Baltimore had the largest free black population of any city in America, with 10 free people of color for every enslaved person within city limits. But the slave trade posed a constant threat to everyone with dark skin. Kidnapping was rampant. Free black adults and children lived in terror of being snatched off the streets and sold into slavery. The boundary between freedom and bondage was terrifyingly thin. When Slatter arrived, the Baltimore slave trade was already established. The pioneer was Austin Woolfolk, a Tennessee native who had arrived in 1815 at just 19 years old. Woolfolk revolutionized the business through aggressive newspaper advertising and the construction of Baltimore's first private slave jail. His tagline, "Cash for Negroes," became a brand. By the 1820s, Woolfolk had transported more than 2,600 enslaved people from Baltimore to New Orleans. He also became notorious for viciously attacking Benjamin Lundy, the editor of an abolitionist newspaper called The Genius of Universal Emancipation, after Lundy called him a monster in human shape. The judge who heard the assault case fined Woolfolk exactly $1. By 1835, Woolfolk's dominance was fading, partly due to competition from the giant Alexandria-based firm of Franklin and Armfield. Into this vacuum stepped Hope H. Slatter. That year, he was described as the main one of a dozen slave traders doing business in Baltimore. A Maine-born schoolteacher named Solon Beale later recounted Slatter's rise. Around 1837 or 1838, Beale wrote, Hope Hill Slatter, a son of Methodist parents of Georgia, came to Baltimore having borrowed $4,000 from his mother and embarked in the business of buying and selling slaves. Beale noted that Slatter was never a member of the Methodist Church while in Baltimore, nor did he profess in any way to be a religious man. That $4,000 loan from his mother would prove to be one of history's most profitable investments in human suffering. Adjusted for inflation, it would be worth roughly $111,000 today. With that capital, Slatter would build an empire. In 1838, Slatter announced the opening of his new headquarters in the Baltimore Sun. Under the heading Cash for Negroes, he advertised a private jail at Pratt and Howard Streets, not surpassed by any establishment of the kind in the United States. He offered to house and feed enslaved people there for 25 cents a day, declaring, "I hold myself bound to make good all jailbreaking or escapes from my establishment." The message to fellow traders was clear. Bring your human merchandise to Slatter, and he would keep them secure until shipment. To keep the supply flowing, he added that cash and the highest prices will at all times be given for likely slaves of both sexes. The layout of Slatter's operation revealed the mechanics of the trade. His house stood at one end of the property on West Pratt Street. At the other end rose a two-story brick building designed to hold enslaved people. The yard between them measured roughly 40 by 75 feet and contained some benches, a water nozzle, wash tubs, clotheslines, a brick fireplace, and an auction block. Bars covered the windows. A large, ferocious dog was kept in a small enclosure, trained to attack anyone, white or black, except the head attendant. The tunnel discovered in 1937 connected the property to the docks, allowing Slatter to move his human cargo out of public sight. Slatter ran his operation with business-like efficiency. His advertisements appeared in the Sun almost daily. His agents fanned out across Maryland's farms and plantations, making deals with slaveholders looking to liquidate what they considered surplus property. When Slatter accumulated enough people to fill a ship, he would arrange transport to Fells Point, where vessels waited to carry them south. The shipments went out on Saturday nights under cover of darkness. The processions along Pratt Street became a grim spectacle that even pro-slavery Baltimoreans found uncomfortable. Enslaved men, women, and children were marched in chains through the city streets while weeping family members followed, knowing they would likely never see their loved ones again. One abolitionist witness described the scene. The trader's heart was callous to the wailings of the anguished mother for her child. He heeded not the sobs of the young wife for her husband. I saw a mother whose very frame was convulsed with anguish for her firstborn, a girl of 18, who had been sold to this dealer and was among the number then shipped. I saw a young man who kept pace with the carriages, that he might catch one more glimpse of a dear friend, before she was torn forever from his sight. As she saw him, she burst into a flood of tears, sorrowing most of all that they should see each other's faces no more. Facing complaints about these processions, Slatter found a solution that was innovative in its cynicism. He hired newfangled horse-drawn omnibuses to move the enslaved from his jail to the docks. He would follow on horseback, the businessman overseeing his cargo. The omnibuses allowed him to transport human beings while maintaining a veneer of respectability. No more chains visible on the city streets, just covered carriages carrying their invisible passengers to ships bound for New Orleans. The journey south was itself a horror. Slatter had negotiated fixed rates with ship captains. An 1844 bill of lading found decades later in Atlantic City government documents revealed the pricing structure. $12 each to transport those over 10 years old, $6 for those under 10 years old, and children at the breast no charge. The casual brutality of that pricing speaks volumes. Nursing infants were literally worthless cargo, included as accessories to their mothers. Children under 10 were worth exactly half an adult's shipping cost. At the other end of the supply chain waited Shadrach Slatter. The younger brother operated out of a showroom at the corner of Esplanade and Moreau Streets in New Orleans, part of a cluster of slave trading depots just east of the French Quarter. His role was to preside over a showroom of captives taken from the mid-Atlantic states and put on sale. The brothers had created a vertically integrated human trafficking operation, controlling both ends of the supply chain. Slatter's son, Henry F. Slatter, also worked in the family business, escorting shipments between Baltimore and New Orleans. The family enterprise prospered. Slatter and his brother, along with Austin Woolfolk, Bernard M. Campbell, and Joseph S. Donovan, have been described by historians as the tycoons of the slave trade in the Upper South, collectively responsible for the forced departures of approximately 9,000 captives from Baltimore to New Orleans. Slatter alone shipped more than 2,000 people in less than 14 years of trading in Baltimore. Each represented a life torn from family, from community, from everything familiar, transported hundreds of miles to labor in conditions that often killed within years. The Slatter operation was truly a family affair. Hope's son, Henry F. Slatter, worked as a shipper, escorting human cargo from Baltimore to New Orleans and appearing on multiple ship manifests. In August 1845, Henry placed identical advertisements with two other traders stating that they had appointed a common agent to handle their affairs while they were away from the city. The traders were constantly in motion, moving between buying markets and selling markets, coordinating shipments, managing the logistics of human trafficking across half a continent. In April 1845, Henry Slatter sold 15 people to a buyer in New Orleans, their names carefully recorded in legal documents: Daniel Powell, James Cephas, Gabriel Lee, Alexander Young, Sylvester Miller, Dick Bell, Robert Spriggs, William Johnston, John King, John Williams, Mordecai Jordan, Brish Barnes, Mathilda Hampton, and Mary Dorsey. These names survive only because a transaction required documentation. How many other names were lost, recorded only in manifests that have since been destroyed or remain undiscovered in archives? Henry F. Slatter died of tuberculosis in 1849, at just 31 years old. He was buried in the family plot in Clinton, Georgia, alongside other Slatters. His death came before the Civil War would end the family business, leaving the question of what he might have done with his profits unresolved. Shadrach Slatter outlived his brother Hope and continued to prosper. By 1860, he was listed in the census as a capitalist with $500,000 in real estate and another $120,000 in personal property. He had moved beyond the retail slave trade into real estate, owning the City Hotel and the New Orleans Arcade, which he rented out for about $40,000 annually. He became a director of the New Orleans, Jackson, and Great Northern Railroad. He also invested heavily in William Walker's filibustering expedition to Nicaragua, part of a scheme by pro-slavery expansionists to extend slaveholding territory into Central America. When federal marshals arrested Walker in 1857, Shadrach posted the $2,000 bond. Walker jumped bail, leaving Shadrach on the hook for the money. Fort Slatter in Nicaragua was named in his honor, a monument to the slave traders' contribution to the cause of American imperialism. Throughout his career, Slatter maintained a peculiar relationship with his critics. Unlike some traders who avoided public attention, Slatter seemed to court it. He gave tours of his jail to visitors, including abolitionists, apparently believing he could convince them that his business was respectable. In 1841, the British abolitionist Joseph Sturge visited Baltimore as part of a tour examining American slavery. Sturge met Slatter and was given a tour of the slave pen. The British Quaker found himself in a strange position, appalled by what he witnessed, yet somehow drawn to Slatter's charm. The two men even maintained a correspondence afterward. Sturge later explained why Slatter had chosen Baltimore as his base. The city is the market where the highest price is generally obtained for them. When abolitionist Oliver Johnson visited the prison around 1840, he was granted permission to enter by Slatter's brother and partner. Johnson found nearly 100 human beings, of all ages and both sexes, locked up like so many wild beasts, and awaiting purchasers. Many flocked around him as he entered, supposing he had come to look at the assortment and make a purchase. Johnson told them he was an abolitionist who abhorred slavery. Among those he met were 2 young girls from Frederick County who had been kidnapped and sold to Slatter for the New Orleans market. When Slatter's brother discovered Johnson taking notes of their story, he erupted in anger. The brother then launched into a defense of his business, assuring Johnson that he was a very conscientious man, that slavery was according to Christianity and justified by the ablest divines in this country, at the North as well as the South. He claimed, "I treat my niggers in the kindest manner. When they arrive at the South, I give them pleasant homes, and everyone is furnished with a good bed and a net to keep off the mosquitoes. Why, there is not a happier set of laborers on God's earth than the slaves of the South." A religious delegation visited Slatter's jail in 1840, and one visitor reported the trader's self-justification. "Gentlemen, I suppose this looks strange to you, coming from the North as you do. I live in a slave state, where the laws fix these matters. These people are with me a short time. I feed and clothe them well, and consider I do not make their condition any worse than it was before." The visitor noted that the place is genteel and comfortable enough for a seminary of learning. But the downcast look of those poor blacks I shall never forget. Slatter assured customers and critics alike that he never broke up families. This claim was marketing fraud designed to salve the consciences of owners unloading their slaves for cash. Historian Ralph Clayton found manifests that told a different story. One ship's manifest listed 2 girls, ages 6 and 4, among the enslaved Slatter was shipping south. Their last names were different from one another and from those of all the adults on board. These children were clearly not traveling with parents. They were alone, perhaps orphans of the trade, perhaps simply separated from families who had no power to keep them. One man who passed through Slatter's operation left behind a detailed account of his experience. Isaac Brown was a black man from Calvert County, Maryland, who had been found guilty of attempted murder in a local court. His punishment was not prison, but sale to the Deep South. Brown was sold to Hope Slatter, who promptly shipped him to New Orleans. Brown described his time in Slatter's slave prison, the routines of confinement, the constant fear of what awaited him at the other end of the journey. In his affidavit, Brown recounted the punishments inflicted on him. 100 lashes on 2 separate occasions during the 33 days he spent in the Calvert County Jail before being transferred to Slatter. Then he was sold to a slave trader named Samuel Y. Harris, who immediately turned him over to Hope H. Slatter. From Slatter's Baltimore jail, Brown was shipped to Louisiana, where he was purchased by William Butler Kenner to work on a sugarcane plantation. But Isaac Brown did not remain a slave. He made a daring escape from Kenner's plantation, traveling over 1,200 miles through slave territory with the help of the Underground Railroad. Free black people and anti-slavery allies guided and protected him on his journey. He arrived safely in Philadelphia in late 1846, going by the name of Samuel Russell. Authorities discovered his location in April 1847, when a letter he had written to his son was intercepted at the St. Leonard, Maryland post office. Maryland's governor immediately issued an order to Pennsylvania's governor, demanding Brown's arrest and return. His case created an outcry among Philadelphia's large free black population and anti-slavery whites. Brown's testimony about his time in Slatter's prison became part of the growing body of evidence abolitionists used to document the horrors of the slave trade. The case of 14-year-old Mary Ellen Brooks revealed the particular horror faced by young women in Slatter's operation. In February 1847, Brooks was sold to Slatter by her Baltimore enslaver, and put aboard the ship Z for a frigid voyage to New Orleans, where she was sold to a local man for $600. She died rapidly of tuberculosis. The purchaser sued Slatter, claiming he had hidden her illness. During the subsequent court case, it emerged that the teenager had been repeatedly assaulted during her time in the trade. The term used in contemporary advertisements was fancy girls, a euphemism for young women sold specifically for sexual exploitation. The combination of illness and assault had killed her. Despite his wealth and success, Slatter found that he was still looked down upon, even by the slaveholders who did business with him. Slave traders occupied an uncomfortable position in Southern society. Everyone knew their services were essential to the slave economy, but few wanted to associate with them socially. The very people who sold human beings to Slatter for profit would not invite him to dinner. Slatter's involvement in one particular incident connected him to one of the most dramatic moments in American anti-slavery history. On the night of April 15, 1848, 77 enslaved people from Washington, D.C., Georgetown, and Alexandria slipped through darkened streets to a wharf on the Potomac River. There, they boarded a schooner called the Pearl, hoping to sail to freedom. The escape was the largest recorded nonviolent slave escape attempt in United States history. Among the passengers were members of the Bell and Edmondson families, including 15-year-old Mary and 13-year-old Emily Edmondson, two of 14 children born to a free black man and an enslaved woman. The Pearl's escape was betrayed, possibly by an informer seeking reward. A steamboat filled with armed men pursued the schooner and captured it near Point Lookout, Maryland. The freedom seekers were brought back to Washington in chains, paraded through streets lined with angry mobs. What happened next connected directly to Hope H. Slatter. Slave traders descended on Washington to purchase the recaptured escapees, who were now considered especially troublesome property, requiring punishment through sale to the Deep South. Slatter purchased approximately 50 of the Pearl freedom seekers. He shipped them to Baltimore and then south to New Orleans, where most disappeared into the brutal labor camps of the Cotton Kingdom. The fate of the Edmondson sisters became a cause célèbre. Joseph Bruin, another trader, initially held them in Alexandria with plans to sell them as fancy girls in New Orleans. The sisters were taken south on a ship where they suffered through a miserable voyage. Emily had such a severe case of seasickness that her brothers feared she might die. Upon arrival in New Orleans, the horror intensified. The sisters were made to stand in an open porch fronting the street, displayed for passers-by to examine. Potential buyers could call and inspect them in the auction room, where they were exposed to coarse jokes and invasive physical examinations. Harriet Beecher Stowe later described how the girls were forced to open their mouths to show their teeth, handled brusquely, and subjected to obscene comments. When a yellow fever outbreak threatened his investment, Bruin brought them back to Alexandria. Their free father, Paul Edmondson, mounted a desperate campaign to purchase his daughters. He traveled on foot, and by whatever transportation he could find, knocking on doors, pleading for help. Armed with letters from supporters, he made his way to New York and met Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, the prominent abolitionist preacher whose sister was Harriet Beecher Stowe. Beecher's congregation raised the $2,250 demanded for the girls' freedom. That same evening, Beecher spoke as if he were pleading for his own father and sisters, and the money was raised on the spot. Mary and Emily Edmondson were liberated on November 4, 1848. The sisters became powerful voices in the abolition movement. They enrolled in the interracial New York Central College in Cortland, New York, where they worked as domestic servants to support themselves while studying. In August 1850, both sisters attended the Fugitive Slave Convention in Cazenovia, New York, to demonstrate against the Fugitive Slave Act. Frederick Douglass led the convention and was photographed, alongside Mary and Emily Edmondson, in one of the most famous anti-slavery images of the era. The sisters participated in mock slave auctions designed by Beecher to attract publicity to the abolitionist cause. Their story of slavery, escape attempt, and suffering repeated at rallies across the North. With continued support from the Beechers, Mary and Emily enrolled at Oberlin College in Ohio in 1853. But tragedy followed. Just 6 months after arriving at Oberlin, Mary Edmondson died of tuberculosis at the age of 20. Emily, heartbroken, returned to Washington and enrolled in the Normal School for Colored Girls, the institution founded by Myrtilla Minor to train young black women as teachers. Harriet Beecher Stowe contributed $1,000 from her Uncle Tom's Cabin royalties to support the school. Emily eventually married, settled in Anacostia, and remained a figure in the fight for African American rights until her death in 1895. One of her granddaughters later wrote that Grandma and Frederick Douglass were like sister and brother, great abolitionists. The Pearl incident galvanized anti-slavery sentiment in ways that would echo for years. New York Congressman John Fur Slingerland was so angered by Slatter's role in purchasing the escapees that he became a vocal advocate for ending the slave trade in Washington, D.C. The incident influenced provisions in the Compromise of 1850 that ended slave trading, though not slavery itself, in the nation's capital. Harriet Beecher Stowe drew on the Edmondson sisters' story and other Pearl-related accounts when writing Uncle Tom's Cabin, the novel that would do more than any other single work to turn Northern opinion against slavery. Around 1848, Slatter sold his Baltimore operation to Bernard M. Campbell and retired from active trading. He had recognized that regional competition, particularly from the dominant Franklin and Armfield firm, limited his future possibilities for profit. He also pioneered using Baltimore's emerging railroad network to ship enslaved people to the Georgia market by rail, demonstrating his constant search for efficiencies in human trafficking. By getting out of the business years before the Civil War would terminate the entire industry, Slatter was able to live off the wealth he had accumulated from exploiting black lives. After his retirement from trading, Slatter built a mansion and lived briefly in Fayetteville, North Carolina, where he was remembered as a well-known and wealthy Negro trader. He owned a sugar plantation in Florida. He eventually settled in Mobile, Alabama, where he became a respected capitalist. The 1850 census recorded him as the legal owner of 82 enslaved people in Mobile, including 75 males aged 25 to 38 and 7 females aged 25 to 40. The skewed demographics suggest these were laborers for a plantation or industrial operation, not a household. In Mobile, Slatter finally achieved the social acceptance that had eluded him in Baltimore. He bought up much of the downtown real estate, owned a theater and a building known as the Old Bank, and became a director of several insurance companies. The slave trade wealth that had made him a pariah in polite Baltimore society made him a pillar of the community in Alabama. He had transformed himself from merchant of human cargo to respectable capitalist. Hope Hall Slatter died on September 15, 1853, a victim of the yellow fever epidemic that swept through the Gulf Coast that year. He was 63 years old. He died intestate, leaving a widow and 4 children, 3 of them minors. The Mobile correspondent of the New Orleans Picayune wrote a glowing obituary. In him, Mobile loses a man she can ill spare, a resident capitalist, and a liberal one too. The article said nothing about the gruesome source of his wealth. Slatter's brother Shadrach survived him by 8 years, dying in 1861 as the Civil War began. By then, Shadrach had amassed a fortune of more than $500,000 in real estate, and was known as a capitalist rather than a trader. He had invested heavily in William Walker's filibustering expedition to Nicaragua, part of a scheme to expand slaveholding territory into Central America. His wealth, like his brother's, remained intact despite its origins. Hope H. Slatter's son, Hope H. Slatter II, grew up in Mobile and attended Georgetown College. When the Civil War came, he joined the Confederate Army as a lieutenant. In 1865, after the Confederacy's defeat, Slatter II wrote to President Andrew Johnson seeking a presidential pardon for fighting against the United States. The pardon was granted on November 13, 1865. The son of the slave trader was free to resume his successful career in business. He would later become the chief of police of Mobile, Alabama. The physical traces of Slatter's operation have largely vanished from Baltimore. The slave jail on Pratt Street is gone, replaced by a brew pub and a glass high-rise. The tunnel discovered in 1937 was filled in and forgotten. The Fells Point docks, where ships loaded their human cargo, now host tourist attractions. There is no plaque, no marker, no memorial at the corner of Pratt and Howard, where thousands passed through Slatter's jail on their way to lifelong bondage. The absence of memory is itself a kind of historical violence. Where the Babe Ruth statue stands outside Camden Yards, slave trader Joseph S. Donovan once operated his private jail, holding enslaved people for shipment to the Deep South. The Frederick Street Dock, now the site where schoolchildren line up for the National Aquarium, was once the embarkation point for more than 2,000 enslaved people sold and shipped by various traders. The very streets that tourists walk today are the same streets where chained processions once moved human cargo toward waiting ships. In recent years, some Baltimoreans have begun the work of remembrance. Historian Ralph Clayton, i.e. Auka, librarian at the Central Pratt Library, spent decades researching the city's slave trade history. A dream of mine would be to have a little Baltimore tour, he said, not showing where Frederick Douglass worked in Fells Point, or where Thurgood Marshall lived, but where the slave traders were, where the slaves were whipped. But he also noted the resistance he encountered. I've run into many people of both races who say, "Why are you digging this up? Leave it alone. The forgetting is not accidental." After the Civil War, white Americans in both the North and South largely chose to move on without confronting the full implications of slavery and the slave trade. The wealth that traders like Slatter accumulated was never confiscated. The families they destroyed were never compensated. The nation reunited around a narrative of mutual valor and shared sacrifice that erased the central cause of the conflict and the suffering of those who had been enslaved. Yet the legacy persists in ways both seen and unseen. The families torn apart by Slatter's operations never reunited. For decades after the Civil War, black families placed advertisements in newspapers searching for relatives lost to the slave trade. The wealth extracted from those families, the labor stolen from those bodies, flowed into the hands of traders like Slatter and the economies they served. That wealth built railroads, funded insurance companies, constructed buildings that still stand. The historian who called Slatter an iconic human trafficker, a diabolical character wringing profits from human tragedy, was not exaggerating. In his 14 years of trading in Baltimore, Slatter sold more than 2,000 people. His brother's operation in New Orleans handled thousands more. Together with their fellow tycoons of the trade, they were responsible for the forced departures of approximately 9,000 captives from Baltimore alone. Each of those 9,000 was a person with a name, a family, hopes and fears and memories that were violated when they were loaded onto ships and sent to places where their humanity was denied. The Second Middle Passage, as historians call the domestic slave trade, forcibly relocated more than 1 million enslaved people from the Upper South to the Deep South between 1808 and 1865. That number is roughly twice the number of Africans originally brought to the colonies that became the United States. About 1/3 of all marriages between enslaved people were broken up by these forced relocations. About 1/5 of enslaved children were separated from their parents. The trauma cascaded through generations. Hope H. Slatter did not invent this system. He inherited a legal framework that classified human beings as property and an economic structure that incentivized their sale. But he perfected the business model. He built the infrastructure. He ran the advertisements. He negotiated the shipping rates. He transported the children at the breast for no charge. He made the system work with brutal efficiency. When Union troops finally liberated the slave jail on Pratt Street on July 24, 1863, 3 weeks after the Battle of Gettysburg, they found 26 men, 1 boy, 29 women, and 3 infants held inside. 16 of the men were shackled together. Colonel William Birney of the United States Colored Troops described the scene in his report to his commanding officer. The building had passed from Slatter to Bernard Campbell, but the human cargo remained the same. In this place I found 26 men, 1 boy, 29 women, and 3 infants, Birney wrote. 16 of the men were shackled, and 1 had his legs chained together by ingeniously contrived locks connected by chains suspended to his waist. The slaves were confined in sweltering cells or in the bricked-in yard, where no tree or shrub grows, and the midday sun pours down its scorching rays. Colonel Birney presented Special Order Number 202, giving him authority to free the slaves held in the traders' pens throughout the city. The men who walked out of that jail enlisted in the United States Colored Troops, transforming in a single day from property to soldiers fighting for the freedom of their people. A large crowd of family, friends, and well-wishers greeted them as they emerged into freedom. For the first time in decades, no enslaved person would spend the night within those walls. The liberation of Baltimore's slave jails was part of a larger transformation. Throughout the South, the institution that had made men like Slatter wealthy was collapsing. The enslaved were fleeing to Union lines, enlisting in the army, and claiming freedom wherever they could find it. The wealth that traders had accumulated remained, but the system that had generated it was dying. The jail that Hope H. Slatter built to hold human beings for sale eventually became a Baltimore landmark, standing into the 20th century. In 1910, a photographer posed 2 men at its barred window, documenting what remained of this monument to human trafficking. An aged Baltimorean named Resin Williams, who had worked for Slatter as a free black man, told interviewers in the 1930s about his job judging the enslaved people's physical condition and leading them through the tunnel. It was a pitiful sight to see them, Williams said, half naked, some whipped into submission, cast into slave pens surrounded by iron bars. Today, if you walk down Pratt Street in Baltimore, you will pass the spot where Slatter's jail once stood. You will see no marker explaining what happened there. You will not know that beneath your feet may lie the remnants of a tunnel that once moved human beings in darkness. You will not see the ghosts of the thousands who passed through those walls on their way to lives of bondage in the cotton fields and sugar plantations of the Deep South. Hope Hull Slatter was born to Methodist parents who gave him a name, meaning for a better future. He used that name to advertise the buying and selling of human souls. He died wealthy and respected, his crimes forgotten by the community that embraced him. His descendants received presidential pardons and positions of authority. The people he sold received nothing. Their names survive only in shipping manifests and court records, entries in ledgers that treated them as inventory. This is how slavery worked in America. Not through dramatic moments of violence alone, though those existed, but through the quiet accumulation of routine cruelties. Through advertisements in newspapers, through negotiations over shipping rates, through family businesses that passed from father to son, through tunnels built underground so that the work of human trafficking could proceed out of sight, through the transformation of human suffering into capital that would outlast the institution itself. The domestic slave trade was not a marginal aspect of American slavery. It was central to its expansion and profitability. Without traders like Slatter, the Cotton Kingdom could not have grown as rapidly as it did. Without the forced migration of more than 1 million people from the Upper South to the Deep South, American economic development would have taken a different path. The wealth generated by enslaved labor, transported by traders, financed the nation's growth. Hope H. Slatter understood all of this. He built his fortune on it. And when he died, he left behind a legacy that continues to shape the nation he helped build, whether we acknowledge it or not.